a slave woman whose name will be forever linked to one of America's founding fathers. When 3-year-old Sally Hemings arrived at Monticello as part of an inheritance for Thomas Jefferson, she could not have guessed the adventure her life would become. But when we examine Sally's life and the difficult choices she made, we are forced to focus less on the possibility of a romantic relationship between man and woman, and more on the disturbing dynamic between slave and master.
She was a mother. She was a slave woman. She was an African-American woman who did the best she could for her children.
She would have to find a way to live as best she could, which tells me that she had to be a very strong woman.
The story of Tom and Sally is the longest-running miniseries or soap opera in American history.
How she felt about him? Who knows? Being owned is not exactly a desirable state of affairs.
They were together longer than some marriages exist. Yes, I understand she was a slave, but I also know that slaves did fall in love at some time with their masters.
Jefferson is so symbolic of the contradictions in American history. Sally Hemings has been a symbol as well of the denial of African American oral traditions.
The papers were covering it as if she were Monica Lewinsky. Was it a scandal? Of course it was. Do we look at it with new eyes? I think we do.
In November 1998, a tantalizing mystery about the private life of Thomas Jefferson yielded to science, shedding light on one of America's most complex and controversial presidents and his slave named Sally Hemings. Through a DNA study, scholars found that in all likelihood, the author of the Declaration of Independence had a sexual relationship with Hemings and fathered her children.
It was the weight of all of that evidence that led us to believe that there was likely a relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
This was front-page news around the country, but to the descendants of Sally Hemings, who had passed it down for more than 2 centuries, it was considered common knowledge. The details of Hemings' life are sketchy, even contradictory, and the facts hard to pin down. There are no photographs or drawings of her, but from what is known, Sally lived a remarkable, courageous life as a slave, presidential mistress, and mother. The first Hemings to put Sally's story into the public record was her son, Madison. In 1873, the 68-year-old Madison dictated his memoirs to an Ohio newspaper reporter.
The Pike County Republican decided they were going to do a series of stories that had to do with ex-slaves. Madison was one of the most well-known ex-slaves that lived in the community. As a matter of fact, all of his neighbors knew the story of what his purported lineage was.
For the first time, Sally Hemings' life was presented to the world. The story of the woman who would become renowned as Dusky Sally began with her grandmother in West Africa in the mid-1700s. The young woman, known as Baya Baya, was rounded up with others and forced onto a slave ship.
Baya Baya became a slave in America. It was customary during that time that if you have a friend to visit you, not only do you feed him his food and his drink, they also would offer you a bed partner. This young girl, the African girl, was given to John Hemings.
Sex with Captain Hemings produced a daughter, Betty. The girl grew up as a slave on the tobacco plantation of a man named John Wales in Virginia. Betty would have a fate similar to her mother's.
John Wells had been married several times and his wives had died. He took her as his concubine, and she bore 6 children for him.
One of their children, Sally, was born in 1773. Even though her father and 3 of her grandparents were white, making her 3/4 white, Sally Hemings was still considered black and a slave.
If you had a child and you were an enslaved woman, then your children also became slaves. And with that, parents didn't have say over what would happen to their children when they grew up. They would have to answer to someone else for the major events in their lives.
Baby Sally had a white half-sister named Martha from her master's first marriage. The year before Sally was born, Martha had married a wealthy 29-year-old revolutionary named Thomas Jefferson. By all accounts, Thomas and Martha were deeply in love. The year after Martha's marriage, her father died. She inherited Betty Hemings and her children. Sally was just 2 years old when she moved to the Jeffersons' mountaintop estate, Monticello. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson listed Betty and all her children in his farm records with their last name, an early indication that Sally would lead a life quite different from that of most slaves.
This is rare both at Monticello and on other plantations. A common method of referring to enslaved people is by referring to them by their first names only. I think it's clear that the Hemings family was different from other enslaved families at Monticello.
The sort of up front and center slaves at Cello were almost all Hemingses. Almost all of them were very light-skinned. Some of them looked almost completely white. It was a way in which Jefferson, in some sense, concealed from others and perhaps even concealed from himself the reality of slavery by giving it a face that looked more acceptable.
Special treatment, however, did not mean a life of leisure. Young Sally, like all slave girls, went to work as soon as she was old enough.
Young girls on southern plantations generally started helping out with childcare from the age of about 6. If they were the children of house servants, as Sally Hemings was, they might care for the young children of the plantation owner. And this was probably the case for Sally Hemings.
As she grew older, her responsibilities would have increased, and she would have gone into weaving and spinning, learning how to make cloth, and from there she would have been trained specifically to do a certain type of work.
Sally did have one advantage that many slaves did not. She was raised by her mother and grew up with her siblings.
One of the things that I think challenged many people was the whole idea that their children would grow up without knowing who they were. I think that the important thing for someone like Sally Hemings would have been that she would have been part of a family.
Sally was able to work side by side with all her brothers and sisters, and perhaps her greatest influence, her mother, Betty. These years were busy ones for the master of the plantation as well. Long before he became president, Thomas Jefferson was shaping the American Revolution. In June 1776, the 33-year-old wrote the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. His first draft included a passage blaming England's King George III for the slave trade and calling for its abolition.
Jefferson recognized that slavery was incompatible with the values of the Declaration of Independence and incompatible with the values of the American Revolution. But he was trapped within that condition, he himself a slave owner.
Thomas Jefferson was no different than the other men of his time. Yes, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They have the right to property. My people were property."
The Continental Congress rejected Jefferson's anti-slave passage as too controversial. Jefferson returned to Monticello after the Congress disbanded and served as governor of Virginia for the duration of the Revolutionary War. Sally Hemings and Jefferson's other slaves maintained a steady rhythm of life, while the fight for independence was raging around them. Not all was well at the plantation, however. In the main house, Martha Jefferson had given birth to 5 children during the first 9 years of her marriage. Only 2 daughters survived. The strain of the pregnancies was devastating to Martha's health. Weak and exhausted, she gave birth to her 6th child, Lucy, in 1782. Then Martha's body gave out. Tradition holds that on her deathbed, Martha gave this bell to 9-year-old Sally. Thomas was at Martha's side when his wife died at the age of 37.
There's a story that was current in the enslaved community at Monticello about a deathbed promise that Thomas Jefferson made to his wife, Martha, as she lay dying, not to marry again.
Jefferson was inconsolable for weeks, but life at Monticello carried on. Young Sally continued to serve Jefferson's daughters, Patsy, Polly, and the newborn Lucy. The Revolutionary War ended in triumph the following year, but Thomas Jefferson was still depressed over his wife's death. So in 1784, he accepted a post overseas.
He was overwhelmed with grief, and in part he needed to flee the memories of Martha at Monticello, and so he accepted a post as American minister in Paris.
Jefferson took with him his oldest daughter, Patsy, and 1 slave, Sally's older brother, James Hemings. Young Sally, who by some accounts bore a strong resemblance to her half-sister Martha, stayed behind. After a few years, she would join her brother and her master in Paris, and her life would be transformed. In the mid-1780s, the teenage Sally Hemings had no way of knowing that she was about to be launched on a journey unlike that of any American slave. Her master, Thomas Jefferson, still in mourning for his wife Martha, had taken a post in France as the American ambassador. His oldest daughter, Patsy, was living with him, along with Sally's older brother, James.
Make your 7 hours of sleep the best they can be with up to 50% off beds and mattresses. Plus,
Sally was sent to live with Jefferson's younger daughters, Polly and Lucy, at their aunt and uncle's Virginia plantation. Sally's primary duty there was to wait on the 2 girls. While Jefferson was overseas, he received heartbreaking news. Both his daughters had contracted whooping cough, and 2-year-old Lucy had died.
Jefferson became more and more anxious to have Polly present with him in Paris, and wrote and said, please make arrangements to send Polly to me in France.
By the time Polly's trip was finally arranged, the middle-aged slave who was supposed to accompany her had fallen ill, so 14-year-old Sally Hemings was sent in her place.
We assume that Sally Hemings was chosen to be Polly's companion because she had been her companion through childhood and was considered her maid.
The 2 girls crossed the Atlantic and arrived in London, where they were met by the American ambassador, John Adams, and his wife, Abigail.
Adams was somewhat aghast because Sally, at this point, would have been between 14 and 15. Abigail Adams, to her horror, saw this young girl who she thought was wholly unequipped to handle Polly. But nevertheless, she had crossed the ocean with her and had made it there safely.
The original plan was to send Polly's companion back to Virginia right away. But with Jefferson's approval, the plan changed. Sally would stay in London with Polly and move on with her to Paris.
Abigail Adams did buy both of them clothes. She outfitted Sally and outfitted Polly so that they would be presentable in France.
I've always wondered why Sally Hemings continued on, across the ocean to London and then to France. It does seem that Sally Hemings was the one constant in Polly Jefferson's life at this time.
Smallpox was a problem in Europe, so the first thing Jefferson did upon Sally's arrival in France was to have her inoculated.
That probably was a somewhat frightening procedure, and you had to be quarantined for several weeks. So she was probably taken somewhere outside of Paris, because that was the law at that time.
Sally Hemings was now ready to embark on an adventure that most Virginia girls, much less slaves, could only dream about: living in Paris. Paris in 1787 was a vibrant, dynamic city. Exquisite architecture rose high above the streets, in direct contrast to the revolutionary mood of the crowds below. The 14-year-old slave was deluged with new experiences and fresh ideas.
The whole experience must have been incredibly exciting for a young girl, any young girl, and certainly a person who had grown up on a plantation in Virginia.
While she was there, she was given, it is believed by some historians, some tutoring in the French language. She also was given training as a lady's maid, which meant not only was she taught to do the hair of the ladies in the fashion of the day, but she was also taught to launder fine linens and clothing. And then she was taught as a dressmaker in the highest order.
More importantly, slavery did not exist in France.
While she was in Paris, of course, she was free. So Sally was a slave that tasted freedom. I think Sally was able to see herself in a way that gave her a level of self-esteem that she probably never would have had she remained at Monticello.
Here is to the land where harmony is not a condition but a virtue.
James, no doubt, taught Sally how to interact with the French servants in Jefferson's household and helped her learn French customs and culture. James was also being paid for his services. Soon, so was Sally.
As long as she stayed in France, she was a free person, and so she was paid as a servant would be. However, not as much, but at least she experienced being paid for what you do.
Sally also had the unique experience of living on her own when Jefferson sent her to a boarding house for more than a month. The owner of the house, one Madame Dupre, was the Jefferson family laundress.
There's no reason to suppose that Madame Dupre would be acting as a slave master in that role. All these types of experiences go into making them. It's sort of not the equivalent of a grand tour, but it would be something like that, to find herself in the middle of Paris, in the middle of this very, very opulent time, and having a chance to live on her own.
Jefferson's daughters, Patsy and Polly, who attended a convent school, also introduced Sally to other sides of Parisian life.
We know very little directly about Sally Hemings' duties in Paris, but we know that by the end of that time, she was acting as lady's maid to both Polly and Patsy Jefferson. Some of Polly and Patsy's classmates at the convent actually had their maids living there, and it's not impossible that Sally Hemings might have spent some time at the convent.
Sally's world broadened even more when Patsy turned 17 and began to attend social functions with her father.
We assume that Sally Hemings would have certainly prepared her for these outings, but probably accompanied her on a number of them as well. There are indications in the fact that Jefferson suddenly began buying Sally Hemings more clothing at the same time that he bought his daughter Patsy more clothing.
There were letters that came to Patsy from friends that she had in Paris, and in the letters they always mentioned Sally. Sally seemed to be more a part of what was going on in Patsy's life than she would have been at Monticello.
It would also seem that Ambassador Jefferson was one of those who began to treat Sally differently in Paris. In fact, her son Madison Hemings makes it quite clear in his memoirs that, during that time, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine. The teenage slave from Virginia had forged a completely new life in an exciting and foreign land. Soon, Sally Hemings would be forced to make a choice between the freedom of Paris and returning to America with Thomas Jefferson.
At Bought by Many Pet Insurance, we love dogs, whether they're big or small.
She was living in the home of her master, Thomas Jefferson, the American ambassador. The teenager was growing into a stunning young woman, affectionately called Dashing Sally, and described by others as handsome, with long hair flowing down her back.
The relationship between Jefferson and Hemings probably started in the late 1780s when they were together in Paris, and she was about a 14 or 15-year-old girl.
By 1788, the widowed Jefferson was waxing eloquently in letters about the domestic virtues of American women and life at home.
Jefferson talks about women in his letters as the guardians of virtue in that family unit, and a belief that the bucolic, rural farming world of Virginia is his real favorite and his ideal.
Jefferson was homesick. With his daughters away at school, perhaps he found Sally to be a link to the world he romanticized and yearned for in Virginia. But their relationship might not have been as romantic as their home in the City of Lights suggests.
The debate now has been, was it love or was it rape? And that, in one sense, is an unanswerable question. I have always thought that there had to be some semblance of respect. I don't know if love is too strong a word, but that's something that held those two together.
It was probably, in some sense of the term, consensual, meaning both parties agreed to it, though it was clearly rooted in Jefferson's power. Jefferson owned this woman, and so to call it consensual between master and slave seems a bit of a contradiction.
Jefferson may have been truly attracted to Sally Hemings, perhaps even loved her, but that could not change her station in life.
I think that he had affections and feelings for Sally. I think he was probably very possessive about her as well. But in the meantime, it was okay for him to keep her family and her in a situation where they lived as house servants would live. In the private time, when no one's around and it's just the two of them, of course, now you have man and woman.
And how she felt about him? Who knows? Being owned is not exactly a desirable state of affairs. He could break his promises at any time to her. So she managed him very well, I think.
In the Paris of 1789, Jefferson was enjoying his role as a patron saint and advisor as the masses stormed the Bastille and launched the French Revolution. Then, his well-ordered world came crashing down.
Patsy threatens to convert to Catholicism. As soon as he hears that, he removes her from the convent and makes plans to return to Virginia.
Still, Jefferson had an even bigger problem.
According to Madison Hemings' account, Sally Hemings was pregnant at the time, and she didn't wish to return to Virginia when Jefferson and his daughters were returning.
The other thing that Sally did while she was in Paris was that she learned to bargain. Naturally, she and especially her brother Jamie did not want to return to the enslaved condition again.
Jefferson convinced Sally's brother James to return to America by promising to give him his freedom if he would stay home long enough to teach a replacement what he had learned of French cooking. Sally finally agreed to go home to Monticello as well, but not before striking her own deal.
Thomas Jefferson made extraordinary promises to her, including the fact that her children would be freed at age 21.
She took him at his word, and a number of people say to me, why would she trust him? And that's a very difficult question to answer, but evidently she did and believed that he would do what he said.
The account of Madison Hemings of Jefferson's pledges to Sally Hemings suggest that she had some measure of control over her own life, that there was some mutual trust between the two of them.
Sally and James sailed back to Virginia with Jefferson in 1789. Madison Hemings' memoirs state that soon after Sally returned to Monticello, she gave birth to a child, of whom Thomas Jefferson was the father. It lived but a short time.
There's no record of this child in Jefferson's records, but he didn't have complete records of the slave population at this time. Was there a child? We don't know whether it was a boy or a girl, what the child's name was. None of that is really known.
Jefferson returned to a burgeoning political career. While he was in Europe, the United States Constitution had been written and adopted. He was called on by President George Washington to serve as the nation's first Secretary of State. Jefferson divided his time between the capital in New York and his beloved Virginia. On the mountaintop at Monticello, Sally Hemings' life had also changed drastically.
Sally Hemings had had all of these wonderful experiences while she was living as a free person in Paris. So when she gets back to Monticello, it's back to the drudgery of slavery. There's something about being a slave that had to have torn a psyche down. That self-esteem that she built up, I just wonder how it had begun to collapse when she returned to Monticello.
Sally became pregnant again in 1795, during a period when Jefferson was at home in Virginia. She gave birth to a daughter in October of that year, but the girl died at the age of 2. In 1796, Thomas Jefferson ran for president, but came in second to John Adams. In accordance with the Constitution at that time, Jefferson became vice president. The two men disagreed strongly about national policy, a situation that quickly stirred up intrigue and backstabbing. Sally Hemings might have thought that she was far removed from the political wrangling, but accounts of her relationship with Thomas Jefferson were about to become fodder for newspapers across the country. By 1797, Sally Hemings had been back from Paris for 8 years and had resumed her role as a slave at Monticello. Her master, Vice President Thomas Jefferson, was away much of the time, plotting against his arch-rival and boss, President John Adams. Yet in April 1798, 25-year-old Sally gave birth to her first recorded son, Beverly.
A very striking pattern emerges from this comparison of this information, in that of the 6 children born to Sally Hemings that we know of from Jefferson's records, all were conceived when Jefferson was at Monticello, and several of them were conceived within 3 weeks of his return from an absence in Philadelphia or Washington.
Sally's duties at Monticello were comparatively light after her return from Paris. She took care of Jefferson's chamber and wardrobe, looked after the children, and did some housework and sewing.
When Sally realized what her fate in life was going to be, when she returned to Monticello as a slave, it seems that Sally pretty much lived for this promise that she was able to extract from Thomas Jefferson while she was in Paris, that her children would be freed at age 21.
Hemings lived in several locations near the hilltop at Monticello, before she apparently settled into one of the servants' rooms under the South Terrace. Jefferson's daughter Patsy, now 27, watched over the plantation while her father was away. 25-year-old Sally was obliged to follow Patsy's orders, regardless of her status as Jefferson's mistress, and the unspoken reality that Sally was Patsy's aunt.
She lived in a house with her half-sister's child in charge, telling her what to do. So it must have been a very difficult role for her to be. She must have been a heck of a diplomat to be able to skate on this ice that was so thin.
If Sally ever decided that she made a mistake leaving France and not taking her freedom, what could she do about that? Nothing. She would be stuck with her decision. So it would also put her in a situation that she would have to find a way to live as best she could based on what was available to her.
While Sally Hemings tended to Jefferson's home and the children, the vice president spent most of his time in Philadelphia, embroiled in the struggles of the new American government.
The relationship between Jefferson and Hemings made sense for Jefferson. He was a man obsessed with control. It meant that he could devote the bulk of his other energies to his public career without the customary obligations of a husband.
He had an unexpected bonus. He had Martha's half-sister. Now, having someone who's beautiful, has a spirit and personality and essence of this woman that you loved, but also someone that you own, gives you a situation where you can have your cake and eat it too.
He didn't have to be faithful to her, and we have heard of no other woman during that tenure that occupied his interest, at least publicly. So we think that he was fascinated with her, and that was quite a trick.
They were together longer than some marriages exist. Yes, I understand she was a slave, but I also know that slaves did fall in love at some time with their masters. To say that there could be no feeling is to say that someone that is enslaved is not lovable. To say that there could not have been feeling on the part of Sally also says that a slave could not love.
Whether it was love or just convenience, their relationship would not remain private for long. By 1799, a full-blown political war was raging in Philadelphia. Vice President Thomas Jefferson had secretly enlisted a journalist named James Callender to attack his political enemies, in particular, President John Adams. Criticism of government officials was illegal at the time under the Sedition Act, and Callender ended up in jail. His work didn't entirely tip the scales of victory in the next presidential election, but Jefferson did beat Adams, and Jefferson was sworn in as the third president of the United States in March 1801. Shortly afterwards, Callender was released from jail.
He'd served a year in this really miserable jail, and he suffered. So he said, okay, I'd like to be the postmaster of Richmond. And please also pay my fine that I had to pay, and I can't afford the $200. And essentially, Jefferson has said, you're too hot now. Goodbye and good luck.
Callender brooded for a year over this betrayal before he struck back in the way he knew best.
When Jefferson didn't give him an appointment as postmaster of Richmond, he turned against him, and he used whatever was at his disposal. Sally Hemings was just a tool.
Callender had picked up enough evidence of Jefferson's relationship with Hemings to write an article about it in the Richmond Recorder.
He broke the story in September of 1802 of the woman he called Dusky Sally. Well, the story exploded after he found out that she appeared white. He stopped calling her that and referred to her as the African Venus.
A series of articles explained that Jefferson and Hemings had begun a relationship in Paris and that the pair had children. Callender wrote, "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps and for many years has kept as his concubine one of his slaves. Her name is Sally." Newspapers across the country picked up the story.
As Callender knew, the scandal in Virginia was not so much that the plantation owner was making use sexually of a slave, because that happened all the time. It was that he treated her with respect.
Jefferson himself never directly denied the allegation, but his supporters did. What they could not deny was that there was a slave at Jefferson's home in Virginia named Sally, and that her children bore an uncanny resemblance to the President of the United States. The public was titillated, but Jefferson played the scandal perfectly.
He did things according to the rules of that game. As long as he didn't take Sally down to the church and say, we're going to get married, things were fine.
The story had no long-lasting effect on Jefferson's presidency, and in 1804, he won re-election by a landslide. As for Sally Hemings, no one knows if she had any reaction to the scandal, or even saw the articles about herself.
There's been questions as to whether or not Sally was literate or not, and whether could she read and write. I question if she really did.
Even if Sally was literate, she left no documents behind. But almost 200 years later, DNA test would speak louder than any letter in her own hand ever could. The Jefferson-Hemings sex scandal was still circulating in the newspapers of 1805. But Sally Hemings' life at Monticello maintained its normal pace. The 35-year-old gave birth to a son, Madison, that year. 3 years later, another boy, Eston, was born. Sally's master, Thomas Jefferson, was now 65 and starting to slow down. His second term as president ended in 1809, and Jefferson returned to Monticello for good. His oldest daughter, Patsy, had moved in with her 11 children, and Jefferson loved his role as patriarch and doting grandfather. It was a part he never played with Hemings' children, something that bothered Sally's son, Madison, a great deal. In his memoirs, he recalled that Jefferson was not in the habit of showing partiality or fatherly affection to us children. We were the only children of his by a slave woman. He was affectionate toward his white grandchildren.
Jefferson never acknowledged his paternity of Sally's children. Jefferson recognized that if he were to admit that he was the father, this would have been politically disadvantageous, very harmful to him at that time. But even more important to Jefferson was his own survival in the memory of posterity.
While Jefferson wasn't affectionate to her children, Sally Hemings did achieve one important victory. Jefferson kept the promise he made to her in Paris 30 years earlier. In 1822, Sally's older children, Beverly and Harriet, turned 21 and were noted in Jefferson's farm book as runaways.
There were runaways periodically over the course of Jefferson's life as a slaveholder. And he usually made an attempt to recover his escaped slaves and would expend considerable money to bring them back to Monticello.
But not Sally's children. They were allowed to leave. Harriet was even given $50 and put on a stagecoach. Noting them as runaways was an unofficial method of freeing them. Both passed as white, later married, and lived in white society. Jefferson's actions may have given them their freedom, but it was their mother, Sally, who traded her freedom for theirs and prepared them for life after slavery.
Sally did give her children a head start in the world. She certainly raised them to be hardworking and skillful and literate. She taught them a way to get around in the world.
On July 4th, 1826, 4 years after freeing Sally's children, and 50 years to the day after signing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died. In Jefferson's will, he freed only 5 of his 130 slaves. All were members of the Hemings clan. 3 were older men, well past their prime. The other 2 were 21-year-old Madison Hemings and 18-year-old Eston.
Not only did Thomas Jefferson free these 2 boys, he also made a petition to the legislature to allow them to stay in the state of Virginia. The rule at that time was that if you're a freed slave and you stay in the state of Virginia past a year, you automatically could become enslaved again.
Madison and Eston Hemings did stay in Virginia as free men. But Sally was not freed in Jefferson's will.
he actually told his daughter to free Sally after he had died. So she did what's called giving her time, which was letting a slave go and not requiring that the slave be chased down and recaptured.
She could live away from Monticello, and she could live with her sons and live out her days as a person who had freedom, but not quite.
Hemings and her two sons moved to the town of Charlottesville, near Monticello. She lived in a house on West Main Street until she died at the age of 62, 9 years after Jefferson. There is no record of where she was buried. Her sons moved to Ohio after her death. Even though they could have passed into white society like their siblings, they lived as black men. Later, Eston moved his family to Wisconsin and into white society. Before the DNA results, the idea of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' relationship was widely discredited. A slow accumulation of letters and documents over 2 centuries brought no definite answer, and oral histories were often ignored.
The simple answer to why no one has paid attention to the Hemings family history or any of the other slave histories up until now is racism. I think that historians presumed, because it's not written down, and because it's oral history, and because the oral history began with slaves, that it can't be trusted.
Jefferson is so symbolic of the contradictions in American history and society, freedom and slavery. Sally Hemings has been a symbol as well, often of the denial of African American oral traditions, even of the African American presence.
In 1998, science intervened. New advances in DNA testing allowed for a sort of historical paternity test. Researchers examined Y chromosomes, which are the same in all male members of any given family. Blood from Eston Hemings' great-great-grandson was tested against that of several Jefferson men to see if the Y chromosomes matched. The test was positive. They were all genetic Jeffersons.
Taken together with all of the extensive historical evidence, this piece of information tipped the balance. It seems most probable that Thomas Jefferson was the father.
Finally, after all of these years has gone by, they're going to have to spend their time trying to disprove themselves rather than me. When we look at our family, the descendants of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, we number probably anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 people.
The relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson might never be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. And whether she loved Jefferson or simply accepted her fate, one thing is certain. Sally Hemings left a legacy to her children and the American people.
She was able to do in her lifetime what many other enslaved women wanted to do in theirs, which was to leave their children a legacy of freedom.
It's not a bad thing to have a mixed heritage. It's a wonderful thing. If America could just see that in their own families. And it's not about color, it's about family, and it's about loving and relating to people as people.
America herself was built on imperfect people trying to come together as one, and they made so many mistakes along the way. Why do we assume now that those same people were perfect? And we hope that we can give somebody a gift from our heritage to say it's okay to talk about it.